on the record.
Can I ask one question? We have two other witnesses that we said we'd make available back in December. Are we able to release those if they want to be released for tonight, since you've already set a list?
Yeah. So can you be more specific?
Sure. We have Blake Kruger and Seth Davison, two other OCA witnesses.
If you want to get through them tonight, my plan is to go to 7:30 or so.
Okay. Then we'll...
That is my plan, so I won't stop unless I hear objections
And we'll
or
go
my
ahead.
court reporter leaves.
Sure. We'll just keep them here and we'll make them available if we can get to them. That'd be fine.
Yeah. All right. Mr. Turner, when we left off,
First, I would like to have the ACS article posted again, and I just wanted to ask one question about that. It's Exhibit 15. Okay, if we could just move it up slightly. You had read the short paragraph right after the introduction, and could you just read the next sentence, the first sentence of the next paragraph?
The NTP report linking radiofrequency radiation to two types of cancer marks a paradigm shift in our understanding of radiation and cancer risk.
Do you agree with that statement?
I think these findings are unique and they would need to be reproduced, but they are a difference from other studies, yes.
Do you think that there will come a time when science has established that radio frequencies do not cause cancer in humans?
In terms of anything that humans do, science can't prove a negative. I mean, we can't prove that there's no risk on any activity. So I think that for all of the regulations that are set, such as drinking water standards and so forth, they're set at levels of acceptable risk. I don't believe that we can regulate human activity to a zero risk level.
So that in the areas that you work in, over time, do acceptable risks change?
Yes, they change as new data becomes available. That's correct.
Do they change in a direction that, at least frequently, in a direction that says we have more information suggesting that the acceptable risk is, there's a greater risk, and therefore the acceptability is less over time? Is that?
They can change in both directions. I think typically with animal studies, what is found is that there's something about the metabolism of the animal system that doesn't apply to humans, and then that would tend to reduce the kind of risk that we might extrapolate from animals. But there are other studies that then say, well, maybe there are other sensitivities that we weren't appreciating before.
One of the statements I heard you make was studies for humans are clouded. That was, I think, a direct quote of something that you said just a moment ago. Do you recall that? Or does that mean anything to you?
I don't necessarily recall it, but I think what I meant probably was that when you're doing human epidemiology studies, it's very difficult to interpret what the actual effect is, because human lives are so complicated. So you may have a group of individuals who have, let's say, a higher cancer rate than this other group of individuals over here, and you look for the differences that they may have in exposure. But because people do so many different things in terms of their personal lifestyles, you can never tell whether a statistical association that you see, let's say with increased cancer with one particular variable, whether that's just an association with no causal basis, or whether it is an association that may provide some information of a causal link.
You're speaking about epidemiological studies.
Yes.
How about clinical studies? How about double-blind, placebo-controlled studies? Are those also complicated because of the nature of humans?
Certainly not to the extent. If there are experimental studies, I mean, you have studies like drug trials, which are essentially studies that are laboratory experiments with humans, and those are pretty unclouded because you assign people randomly to drug or no drug. In terms of studies with volunteers and so forth, those become clouded partly because of things like volunteer bias, recall bias, and so forth. So it's more difficult to extrapolate a causal link from those kinds of studies.
Has the science, as you understand it, concerning radio frequencies continued to develop the idea that those frequencies are increasingly understood to be likely to cause cancer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the most recent review that the World Health Organization did on this is a publication in 2010, and at that time, which of course is quite some time ago now, they had not seen any increase in the likelihood of cancer from their assessment, which I think last assessment may have been made about 2006.
How do you interpret the words paradigm shift in that quotation?
Well, I think that the paradigm shift here is that you do have an animal species that underwent this, very vigorous exposure, I mean, of radio frequency that did show a statistically significant result. Now, you have to remember, statistically significant results are done to the 95% confidence interval. And so that means that the result, there's still a 5% chance that it was due to chance. And so that's why things will need to be looked at closely and so forth. But, I mean, the statistical significance is there, and it was a carefully done study.
Do you think it's possible that radio frequencies might cause cancer in humans?
I can't answer that in the abstract. I think on the basis of this study, I don't think I could draw that conclusion.
Do you think this study shows that it's impossible for radio frequencies to cause cancer in humans?
Well, I think even the authors themselves suggest that, while the study, this is on the second page, while the study adds significantly to the evidence that cell phone signals could potentially impact human health, it does not tell us how certain scenarios of cell phone use change our long-term risks of getting cancer.
When you say change our long-term risk, does the risk change, or does our awareness of the risk change?
Well, according to American Cancer Society statistics, excuse me, we all have a very high risk of getting cancer. I mean, we have approximately, everyone in this room has a 40% chance of contracting cancer sometime in their lifetime, and those statistics have been steady over the years. Cancer is basically a disease of old age, and so the biggest risk factor for cancer is age. And so when you look at something like an additional risk, cigarette smoking, if you will, then what happens is that those individuals have a higher than background risk. And so I think in terms of actual risk, that's the general story. You have to be able to show that there's an increase. Now, you're asking a different question about perception of risk. I mean, and that's an area that I probably shouldn't wander into because that's governed by, lots of personal preferences and so on.
You indicated, as I understood you, that the reason for the NTP study and things of that nature was to give people an opportunity to determine the choice they want to make, or to determine in a way how their behavior would be affected by their knowledge from these studies. Is that a fair statement of what you said?
I'm not sure that's a fair statement. The NTP studies were originally suggested by the Food and Drug Administration to do, because the cell phone is a device, and they wanted to have some input on what the potential risks might be of that device. I don't think that the Food and Drug Administration said to themselves, oh, we want to have people to be able to make decisions and so on. They were trying to find, something quantitative that they could analyze and make some, perhaps, regulatory decisions on.
Do you think that people becoming more and more aware of the kinds of studies that are emerging might choose not to expose themselves or to expose themselves to a lower level of radio frequencies?
I have no comment. I mean, people can choose to do what they want to do. I don't have
But
any.
they can only choose what's available to them to choose. Is that not correct?
Yes, but in terms of what they choose to react to in terms of a potential hazard.
So in this instance, they're being told, even though they might feel that there might be a potential hazard, they're not going to be allowed to choose to have a non-smart meter, basically.
I haven't looked into that side of this particular case, but that's what I understand, that the utility is in that sense a monopoly. However, there are many other things that are monopolies, such as everyone uses a car, and we're exposed to accident risk because everyone has a car and they drive and cause accidents.
I have no further questions.
Board Member Wagner?
I do have one question. Dr. Wahlberg, what remedies are available to customers or individuals regarding health concerns raised by the interveners?
I guess the remedy that I would suggest is to say that the contribution to the RF background that these meters pose is truly minuscule. I think, as Mr. Reed said when he was here, that being in this room with radio stations, television stations, wireless microphones and so forth, that being in this room for about 6 minutes equals to an exposure of 1 year to the radio frequency exposure from a smart meter. So I know it's hard to change minds, but I think if radio frequency really is a hazard, I don't think smart meters are going to be our issue. I think the biggest sources are things like radio towers, television towers, mobile phone base stations, and use of cell phones and all sorts of wireless technologies. And I think I heard earlier in this testimony, the thing that really makes this smart meter of a low power is that they have their own licensed band and consequently can be much farther away from the base station as compared to other technologies. And so that means that the actual RFR that these meters have to utilize is very low. And I guess I would just hope that people would not get anxious about it, because I really think being anxious is a health effect. I mean, that being anxious can cause adverse effects.
In your work with IPL, what experience have you seen that IPL has in addressing health concerns like those that have been raised by the interveners?
I don't know if I can answer that. I think IPL is like any other, commercial business. I mean, they try to follow every health regulation they can, and they follow the health regulations that are out there. I don't know that they would feel comfortable suggesting alternative health standards.
Thank you.
Board Member Lozier?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Clisto?
Just some brief redirect. Dr. Wahlberg, I want to direct your attention to the ACS press release that the interveners have put in front of us, which is at Exhibit 15, the first 3 pages. And they've walked you through a couple of the statements from that press release. I would like you to read a few more of the statements. If you could go to the second page, please.
Yes.
And the sentence that begins, "this new evidence." We have to go a little further up, please, on the, oh, there, thank you.
This new evidence will undoubtedly factor into ongoing assessments by regulators to determine the potential cancer risk posed by cell phones. The American Cancer Society eagerly awaits guidance from government agencies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Communications Commission about the safety of cell phone use.
And if you go down to this paragraph that begins, "while this study adds," I know you read the first sentence. If you wouldn't mind reading that paragraph in full, it goes on to the next page then.
While this study adds significantly to the evidence that cell phone signals could potentially impact human health, it does not actually tell us how certain scenarios of cell phone use change our long-term risks of getting cancer. For example, the animal studies were performed at very high signal strengths, near but below the levels that would cause animal tissues to heat up. Additional research will be needed to translate effects at these high doses to what might be expected at the much lower doses received by typical or even high-end cell phone users. Also, cell phone technology continues to evolve, and with each new generation, transmission strengths have declined, and with it, radio frequency exposures.
And then one final point. Dr. Wahlberg, at the beginning of your testimony, you were asked a series of questions from Attorney Marcus about how you represented commentary on the NTP study. And am I correct in saying that he attempted to indicate that you mischaracterized the results of that study?
Yes, that was the implication.
I'm going to direct your attention to that same testimony. He was referring you to page 5 of Wahlberg rebuttal.
Yes.
And if you could read the sentence that begins on line 14 with the word "for."
Yes, line 14. For a specific tumor of the heart, and in male rats only, the NTP results showed a statistical increase in tumors. However, there was no increased risk in any cancer among female rats or among either male or female mice in the study.
And in your opinion, does that statement acknowledge that the NTP results showed an impact on tumors in certain kinds of male rats?
Yes, that there was indeed a statistical increase.
No further questions.
Dr. Wahlberg, you may step down.
Thank you.
And Your Honor, he may be released. He does have a plane to catch as
He
well.
is excused.
Thank you.
6. Mr. Marcus, my question for you is, do you want to call Dr. Havas, or do you want us to go to IPL witness Van Gundy? Okay, you may call your witness. What? Jennifer, will you just test that? Test 1, 2, 3, 4.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. So that mic is live at all times. Please raise your right arm. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate?
I do.
You may be seated. Dr. Marcus, or Mr. Marcus?
Dr. Havas, would you state your full name for the record?
My name's Magda Havas, Havas,
And where do you reside?
in Canada, Peterborough, Canada.
And you provided rebuttal testimony and supplemental rebuttal testimony in this docket?
That's correct.
And to the best of your knowledge, is that testimony, including the exhibits, still true and correct?
Yes.
I would turn the witness over for cross-exam. Oh, excuse me, 1 second.
I would prefer that if you're going to do exhibits 215 to 16, that you do it now.
I'm not. Thank you. I was going to ask if Dr. Havas would take maybe 1 minute to update her testimony, and it has nothing to do with testimony that she forgot or anything like that. It would be an update of events after her testimony, research, new research that, or reports, but just 1 minute.
So all I'm going to ask you to do is ask your witness that in question form.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Havas, are there any significant developments in research that have occurred since your October 19 supplemental rebuttal testimony? And if so, would you just very briefly advise the board and others here of that research?
Yes, the NTP study that we've been talking about, they released their final report on rats in November 1st. So that's since my previous testimony. And that was, their conclusion included a peer review process. So the study has been peer reviewed and it's now available in its final format. And they concluded that there were 2 types of tumors in male rats that were caused by cell phone radiation at 900 megahertz, the same frequency that's used in the smart meter. The second bit of information that's new since my previous testimony was a study in the United Kingdom where they looked at the incidence of brain tumors, and they found that there was an increase in one type of brain tumor. It's a glioma, very similar to what other epidemiological studies have shown, the same tumor that they found in male rats, and the increase is only found in the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. So it's where you end up using your cell phone. So the incidence in the UK is now going up for that type of tumor in those 2 areas, but it's stable or going down for other types of tumors.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
No cross.
No cross-examination.
Mr. Turner?
I do have a couple of questions.
Can you please move your mic closer?
Turn it on.
Your Honor, if I may, 1 moment, please. Ms. Havas is a witness that was presented by Ms. Matera. I do not understand how Ms. Matera's attorney is going to cross-examine her. All the testimony was filed on behalf of Ms. Matera.
Mr. Greiveldinger, was it your intent to bring up this issue?
It literally just occurred to me as I was going through my files to find her testimony.
So,
And we raised the issue of soft cross, but this is even different because it's the attorney who actually, it's the client who actually presented the individual.
Mr. Marcus, why did you choose to present this witness versus allowing Mr. Turner to present and you to ask the questions?
Just because of the long time that I had been involved in the case and my greater familiarity with the issues. We were waiting some time for Mr. Turner to get admitted pro hoc vice, and then it was planned that I would represent only Mr. Lippman and he would represent Ms. Matera.
I also believe that the submissions were made on behalf of both of the clients. We did not know until I was moved in, it sat there for several weeks. We did not know whether I would even be able to be in, so
Mr. Turner, were you involved in any of the testimony that was previously prepared for this witness?
I was not.
Were you on board at that time?
I was on board, but I was on board only in the sense that I talked to Ms. Matera about how I would be taking over once I was sworn in, or once I was accepted. And we waited for quite some time for that. And almost none of that was substantive conversation. I did talk to Mr. Marcus about various procedural things, almost entirely around when I'm going to get, when I would be accepted, what kinds of procedural things would be done, and there was some discussion, but I was not involved in preparing any of the testimony.
Mr. Schuling, do you have anything that you wish to add?
No, I don't.
The board has had conversations about the administrative process of handling what we've deemed to be friendly cross-examination. And other than one other case, a large case, where we did deem that friendly cross was not allowed, we've allowed great flexibility with the information that's being submitted. And as we have no current written process for handling this type of situation, it is my intent to err on the side of caution and to allow Mr. Turner to proceed.
I understand, and IPL is comfortable with that, but we would request that the counsel would not be able to lead the witness and treat it like it's his own witness. So we can't have leading questions. And I would also
Been
just
working on that all day.
and I would also just note that a similar situation could occur with Mr. Sheckley.
And my intent is to rule the same way on all of the witnesses. I would ask, though, that Mr. Turner present them if it was Ms. Matera's witness.
So
all right?
I can do that.
So on this particular witness, Mr. Turner, you may continue.
My first question is that you mentioned the glioma. Could you tell me what a glioma is?
Yes, a glioma is a brain tumor that affects a certain cell, type of cell in the brain called a glial cell. There is something called meningioma, which affects the membrane of the cell, the membrane surrounding the cell. So there are different tumors in the brain that are given different names depending on which cells they cause cancer in.
What's a glioblastoma?
A glioblastoma is a severe form of a glioma. It's a very highly malignant glioma. And the glioblastoma was the one that was found in the study that I just mentioned, the increased incidence in humans in the frontal and temporal lobe.
Those were glioblastomas.
That was a glioblastoma.
And the glioblastoma is the tumor that caused the death of Senator McCain, Senator Kennedy, and Beau Biden.
That's correct.
What is electrohypersensitivity?
Electrohypersensitivity is a term that's been used for people who have developed an intolerance to different electromagnetic frequencies in the range of non-ionizing radiation that includes both radio frequency, intermediate frequency, which is the dirty electricity, and extremely low frequency electromagnetic fields.
Do the FCC regulations address anything other than thermal categories?
The FCC is based almost entirely on thermal. At lower frequencies, they have something called a shock effect. So if you touch something and you get a shock, that's not advisable. So they have guidelines for kilohertz frequencies as well that fall within the dirty electricity, and that's non-thermal. That's a shock reaction.
Could you explain the difference between thermal and non-thermal effects?
Yes, for thermal effects, it's really dependent on how much power there is. And initially, when microwave guidelines were developed, it came out of the radar World War II and radar research, because that was the only form of microwave radiation that people were exposed to. There was no other source. And the U.S. military was concerned that there must be some limit beyond which someone in the military should not be exposed. And they realized that microwave radiation excites water and can cause it to vibrate and can cause a heating effect. And that's what the microwave oven was based on, the military research of radar. And so they came up with a value that can actually vibrate water molecules and increase the temperature, and it's based on a 1 degree temperature rise in 1 gram of tissue. A non-thermal effect is not based on heat at all. It's not based on energy. It's based on frequency and modulation, and it's based on the information that the human body receives.
So are you saying that the FCC regulations don't address the non-thermal issues?
Correct. For microwave radiation, which is what we're talking about, 900 megahertz, they don't address anything other than thermal.
Is microwave radiation related to the issues raised by the State Department about Cuba and Russia and the American embassies?
Yes, there was an embassy in Russia, a U.S. embassy in Russia back in the 1960s and 70s that was bombarded by microwave radiation, and the people at the embassy became quite ill. And the U.S. Didn't know what was causing it. They initially thought it was a water quality problem in Moscow. And then they realized that the embassy was being radiated with microwaves, and that was making people sick. And I think some of the people in the embassy came down with leukemia and cataracts, which are two effects of microwave radiation.
Could you compare the health effects of analog meters, digital meters, and smart meters?
Yes, an analog meter is a very simple motor, and it doesn't produce any dirty electricity, and it doesn't radiate radio frequencies at all. An RF meter, my understanding is that it produces dirty power on electrical wires in a home, but it doesn't radiate radio frequency radiation. And a smart meter produces both dirty electricity and radio frequency radiation, so it transmits it through the air to a receiver.
If an apartment building has a number of meters, does that increase the exposure for an individual in that apartment building?
Definitely.
Could you describe how that would work?
Well, each smart meter would ping whatever the frequency range is. That ping goes through the air in all directions. It's generally non-directional. And anyone within the range of that ping, their body would be exposed to the radiation to whatever degree. The further away they are from it, the lower the intensity. The closer they are, the higher the intensity. The more pings your body gets, the more disturbed it becomes at the frequencies that we're talking about.
So that an individual living in the proximity of more than 1 meter would receive more pings, so to speak.
Correct. If you're close, a smart meter has to interact with an antenna, and whatever that distance is, anyone within that distance is going to be affected by that. The meter can actually go beyond the antenna, but at least within that distance, you would be exposed.
And that would be multiplied by the number of meters that were on the side of the apartment building, let's say.
Correct.
Does that work also if there are meters in a community of houses?
Yes.
Explain how that would work.
Well, if you have neighbors next to each other, once again, they're each pinging at different durations or different intensities or different frequencies, and every time there's a ping, you would be potentially exposed to that. Remember, they're both producing dirty electricity as well, which is something that hasn't really been covered from a health perspective so far, and that dirty electricity travels along wires. And if you're using the same transformer, you share that dirty power.
And so if a meter is pinging 7 times in a household, but there are 10 houses within 10 miles, they all might be pinging at the same time as far as the individual is concerned.
I probably wouldn't go to a 10-mile limit. I think that's probably too far, but certainly within 300 to 500 meters, I would be concerned.
Is there a difference between biological response to electromagnetic energy that is intermittent compared with the same kind of energy that is continuous?
Yes. When they first started doing research in this area, they found that when they exposed people or animals, mostly animals, to continuous waves. They weren't nearly as harmful as intermittent or pulsed radiation. And scientists were trying to figure out why that was. They couldn't figure it out, and there's two potential reasons for it. One is when you have continuous radiation, the maximum, so you've got something that's changing a little bit, but it's pretty continuous, the maximum and the average values are really close to each other. When you're dealing with pulsed radiation, you end up having a peak and then nothing, and a peak and then nothing. If you average those, you're in here, and if you take a maximum, you're up here. So in some cases, you're comparing apples and oranges if you look at averages. That's why it's so important to look at maximum value. So that's one of the reasons that some of the early studies might have found that pulse radiation is more biologically active than continuous wave. The other thing that we've recognized is that because it's not a thermal effect, we find that humans and any kind of living organism, they're electromagnetic. So all of our nervous system is electromagnetic. And our cells are communicating with each other electromagnetically. That's been shown. There's no controversy about that. If you interfere with that communication by putting out a frequency that's interpreted by your body to represent some activity, then that's going to affect your body. Or if you send out a frequency that interferes with cells communicating with each other, that's going to have a biological effect as well. So the real concern, in a sense, the paradigm shift when it comes to electromagnetic energy is that it's a form of communication, electromagnetic communication. It's disrupting that communication within your body and hence having deleterious effects.
So that one pulse could cause problems if it interacted with an individual.
One pulse could cause problems. I'd be less concerned with one pulse a day, obviously. But the more pulses they are, the more concern there is. And that's why it was so important to get a sense of how many pulses these meters provide. But remember, that's RF. There's still a continuous dirty electricity element to that. So while you might be exposed to 7 pulses, if the information is accurate, you're exposed to dirty electricity 24/7. And those are multiple pulses.
Does the FCC have any kind of regulation or guidance on the issue of pulsing?
The issue of pulsing with respect to radio frequencies?
Yes, the radio frequency.
Not that I know of, apart from just the frequency. So they have, as you talked about earlier, depending on what the frequency is, there are different guidelines.
Have they referred guidance to the IEEE for looking at pulsing guidance?
Yeah, pulsing is a real problem, and the IEEE has recognized this for a long time, especially any kind of pulsing on electrical wires, and they have guidelines that take care of that. So when a utility distributes electricity to their customers, they have to ensure that it's clean electricity. It's a nice 60 hertz sine wave, but a lot of the technology we have today produces pulses on the electrical wire. And that damages electronic equipment. It's called electromagnetic interference. It causes motors to run hot. And it turns out that those frequencies also affect biological material. So there are 2 types of pulsing. One is the ping that's sent out through radio frequency, and then there's the irregular pulsing, but on a continuous basis along the wire as well.
So I understand you to say that the interference with other electronic equipment is comparable to the interference with the essentially electromagnetic nature of human cells in the human body.
That's correct.
And we know less about this than we know less about the human body's interference than we do about interference with other electromagnetic devices.
Exactly. If you have a circuit board, electronics, if there's a misconnect in some way, then you can diagnose it very quickly. With a human, we have homeostatic mechanisms, so when certain things happen to us, our body adjusts. And because it's such a complicated thing, that's why it's so difficult to understand what the specific mechanism is, because there are so many mechanisms that are involved.
How does the number of pulses affect that dynamic?
The more pulses they are, every single time you get a pulse, your body's exposed to that. And so depending on the frequency and how it affects your body, you could be reacting to it every single time. So when you measure the 3,000 pulses on some of those meters, I would expect that the people living in those homes would become quite ill fairly quickly based on my understanding of electrical sensitivity and my experience with people who are sensitive.
So as I understand it, what you're saying is that if there are a few pulses, it's less likely that a person will be affected by the pulse. But that's a measure of how likely they are to be hit with something that's harmful than how harmful or not the pulse itself is.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
We talked about electro-hypersensitivity. Are you saying that there are people who are more susceptible to this kind of pulsing than others?
Yes, and that's recognized by the World Health Organization, that there are a certain percentage of our population is electrically hypersensitive, and let me just go back. Everyone is electrically sensitive. So all of us react to electromagnetic energy in our environment. When we classify someone as being electro-hypersensitive as opposed to electrosensitive, they react at much lower levels, at much lower intensities than the rest of the population. And we now know that these people react at levels below the current guidelines. The guidelines don't take into account electro-hypersensitivity. There are different estimates as to what percentage of the population is affected. Right now, I think the scientific community thinks it's between 8 and 10% that have severe symptoms in the population in a highly built-up city, for example, rather than someone living in the country. I tend to use a conservative estimate. I think that probably 3 to 5% of the population have severe symptoms, but another 35% of the population have mild to moderate symptoms. And these people would develop a headache, they would have difficulty sleeping, but they could still function. Once you're in the 3% or 3 to 5% group, you could not be in this building for any length of time without suffering for days or weeks afterwards. These are people who could not live in their home if they're exposed to the dirty power or the dirty power plus the radio frequency radiation. And a lot of the people who contact me, I'm contacted from people all over the world, but mostly from North America. One of the questions they ask is, where do I move to? Because I can't live in my home. Are there safe places to go? And what's beginning to develop is there are safe havens for these individuals. One's in West Virginia, and another one is in Snowflake, Arizona. So people are actually looking for these places so they can get away from the radiation.
Why are those places more safer for them?
Snowflake, Arizona is in the middle of nowhere. It's an absolute, I've been there, it's an absolutely horrible environment that no one wants to live in. And they don't have cell towers, they don't have any kind of wireless communication. In Green Bank, West Virginia, they have a radio telescope that is designed to collect, these are large arrays that are designed to collect microwave radiation from outer space, trying to understand the microwave environment. And they're extremely sensitive antennas to pick up the equivalent of a whisper. And so you can't have a cell phone in that community because it would interfere with their transmission. You can't have fluorescent light bulbs. If you have a refrigerator that is malfunctioning and producing dirty power, they will come and replace it for you free of charge so that their antennas can function properly. And so people who are electrically hypersensitive have gone there, in some cases for a few weeks or a few months to recover, and in other cases to live.
Do you understand what the buddy communications system is within the network, that network of meters that IPL is planning to put into the...
what communication?
Buddy.
Oh, buddy, yes, I understand the buddy system. Yeah.
I understood earlier today that the main way of dealing with eliminating the buddy system was to create more cell towers. Did you hear that testimony?
I wasn't here for that. I think that
If
might have been...
if the idea was to correct the multiple communications from the buddy system was to build more cell towers, would that address the health problems that you're talking about?
Okay, the buddy system, anything that interferes with the communication of a smart meter and ultimately the utility, whatever interferes with that, would then require a buddy system. So building a new cell tower may or may not help if that's, if it's a boundary problem. So it really depends on what's causing the buddy system to function as to what the solution is. Building more repeaters could help, and you'd have to place them properly to minimize that.
What's a repeater?
A repeater is just, it's like a buddy system. It uses a technology where you send the information to a repeater, and the repeater will then send it to the utility, or to the antenna, or to the utility, whatever. With the buddy system, you're using someone else's smart meter to act as a repeater. It's just repeating the information.
Do repeaters take in or do they have their own RF?
It depends on how they're set up. If they're set up as a wired system, then they would send things along a wire. If they're set up as a wireless system, then they would produce RF as well.
Can a wired system be established for metering that would eliminate the RF problems that?
Yes, definitely, depending on the type of smart meter you have. Yes, some can be
Could you describe
sent
how
along.
that would be done?
Well, you can send it along so basically it's a two-way system. A smart meter is a two-way system of communicating. So you're sending information out and you're receiving information as well. That's why they call it smart. You can send that out through the air as radio frequency at 900 megahertz in this particular case. You can send it out along a copper wire. You can send it out along an Ethernet cable. You can send it out through a telephone. You can send it out through your cable television, or you can send it out through fiber optics. So these are alternatives. Very often the utilities don't take that route because it costs more for connecting that wire. And there's more and more evidence now that you can do that inexpensively. Unfortunately, what the utility doesn't take into account are the health effects. So once you start factoring how sick people become once smart meters are put in their home, and you balance the total costs involved, then wiring your smart meter is the smartest thing you can do.
If it's wired, does that create dirty electricity?
Yes, it still creates dirty power. And to get rid of dirty power, you can do that one of two ways. You can have the smart meter with a built-in filter, because they know what the frequencies are that any particular meter generates, and you can put in a tuned filter, or you can filter the home so that anything coming into the home can be, the high frequencies that are riding along that wire can be shorted out with capacitive filters.
What is it costly to put the filter in the meter?
I wouldn't know how much it would cost to filter a meter. I know what it costs to filter a computer, because computers generate dirty power as well, and it's roughly $2 or $3 per computer. So it's not very expensive, but I don't have that for smart meters. I'm sorry.
You mentioned 900, I think you said 900 kilohertz? Or
Megahertz.
Megahertz. Could you tell, what does that mean? What's the significance of that?
900 megahertz is the carrier frequency that smart meters would use, so it might be 901, or I think at some places it's 940. So these are different channels that they use to send the information out. So it's very similar to a radio station that you might dial in 1050 AM or 98.1 FM. It's just a frequency, a carrier frequency.
What was the megahertz number used in the NTP study?
900 as well. So the rats were exposed to radiation at 900 megahertz, which is the same frequency that's being proposed for the smart meters.
Okay. If a community is contains a large number of smart meters that you've been describing. Would somebody who travels through that community on daily activities receive more exposure to this kind of potential health problem?
If you can visually imagine, the answer is yes. If you could visually imagine what's going on, you'd have light bulbs coming on and off, like blinking for short periods of time, but you'd have multiple blinks and slightly different frequencies, slightly different colors. And a person walking through that would then be exposed every time there's a blink, there's a transmission sent, if they're within a certain distance of that smart meter.
Okay. Could you begin by describing dirty electricity, just a very short statement?
Okay. Clean electricity in North America has a frequency of 60 cycles, and it's a sine wave, which means it's just a smooth wave like this. Dirty electricity is the same sine wave, but it has high frequencies. It has radio frequencies superimposed on the sine wave. So if you looked at it on an oscilloscope, it would look like this. And every time there's a spike, it has a potential effect to sensitive electronic equipment. That's why you often plug things into a surge suppressor. So a surge suppressor gets rid of some of the high spikes that you may have. And in areas where there's a lot of dirty electricity, you would find that your light bulbs are burning out, or you have to replace your dishwasher more frequently because it's being adversely affected by the radiation, by the spikes on the electrical wire.
How does that dirty electricity enter the human body?
Well, dirty electricity, it's at a slightly different frequency that we're talking about for the 900 megahertz. It's in the kilohertz range, which means it's thousands of times per second that it's vibrating, as opposed to millions of times per second with megahertz. And because it's a radio frequency, it radiates from the wall. So the closer you are to your wall and the inside wiring, the higher the intensity of the radio frequency. And you can set up meters, and they will measure how much is coming out of the wall. And so basically that's affecting your body just like the higher frequencies would affect your body. And one of the things we found is when the frequency goes above 2,000 cycles per second, it no longer flows around your body, it begins to go internal to your body. So what we're really concerned about are frequencies between 2,000 and 100,000, roughly slightly higher cycles per second. That's the frequency range that we know is biologically harmful.
What range do the smart meters operate in?
I don't know. I haven't seen the data on the smart meters. So I don't know what the frequencies are for dirty power.
Okay. How does the dirty electricity affect the cells when it goes into the body?
We've done some studies with people, and I'm not a cellular biologist, so I don't look at cells. I do look at cells under the microscope, but more from a human perspective. And we found that people who are exposed to dirty electricity have problems with their blood. One of the things we're finding is that if you take a pinprick and you put your blood under a microscope, you should have nice round blood cells that are floating around, sort of not connected to each other. One of the things we're finding with dirty electricity is the blood cells are sticking together, so they're no longer free floating, and they're beginning to stick together in columns. And because of that, what the job of a red blood cell is to bring oxygen to the body and get rid of waste products. So they do that through the surface area. So the less surface area there is, the less they can perform that function. And so people who are electrically hypersensitive can have for lack of a technical term, clodgy blood, where they have really viscous blood that is just not flowing properly. So the circulation gets impaired, and then there's all sorts of secondary problems that can develop from that. The other thing we're finding with dirty electricity is we've worked with diabetics, and we find it increases blood sugar. And now this is a really serious problem because such a large population are coming down with diabetes. And we find that it affects some percentage of the diabetic population. We don't know what it is. And it includes both type 1 and type 2 diabetics.
Your Honor, most of this is already in the witness's testimony, and I would also renew my objection. This seems like it's just a restatement of direct.
Mr. Graveldinger, I would agree with you. Are you, Mr. Turner, how close?
One more minute.
You may proceed.
Does the dirty electricity and the pulsing that you've talked about affect people who are not hypersensitive?
Sorry.
Do these effects that you're talking about, do these causes of effects affect non-hypersensitive people?
We actually use those effects to diagnose hypersensitivity. So there are people who won't respond. Their blood remains normal. Their blood sugar doesn't change. And if you do enough experiments with them and there's absolutely no physiological effect, they don't feel anything, then we would classify them as non-symptomatic, and they're probably not electrically hypersensitive.
Okay. Does an analog meter help solve the problems you're concerned about?
The analog meter is one of the best meters you can have from a health perspective. It doesn't produce dirty power, it doesn't produce radio frequency radiation.
Okay. No more questions.
Board Member Wagner.
I don't have any questions.
Board Member Lozier.
Are we all exposed to dirty electricity?
Yes. Yes.
But are you saying that only hypersensitive, or hyper-electrosensitive people would have adverse health effects?
Yes.
In
terms of symptoms. So we're all exposed to dirty electricity. Your body might be reacting, but you might be totally unaware of the reaction. Whereas other people, and there might be nothing we can measure on you. We might be able to measure brainwave activity, the functioning of your heart, whatever, and we might not be able to document any changes that are attributable to the dirty power. And so we would then classify you as not being hypersensitive.
Does it matter whether a wire is insulated or not in terms of production of dirty electricity?
No. No. Whether a wire is insulated or not will only affect the magnetic field coming from that wire, but it won't affect the dirty electricity unless it's a special kind of covering that shields radio frequencies.
You talked about pulses being particularly harmful. Does the strength of the pulse weigh on that consideration?
To a certain degree, but only a certain degree, and that's because Dr. Wahlberg mentioned that the dose is important, and that comes from chemical toxicology. So the more arsenic I give you, the more likely you are eventually to become poisoned by the arsenic. One of the things we're finding with electromagnetic energy is that there are things called frequency windows and intensity windows, which means that if you look at different frequencies and you're studying some biological response, the response will go up, and then it'll go down, and then there'll be nothing. So that's called a frequency window if you're changing frequencies along this axis. There's also an intensity window, which means that normally in chemical toxicology, the higher the dose, the higher the concentration, the more toxic it becomes. This doesn't apply to electromagnetics. What we find is there's an intensity window, so there's a certain intensity that's extremely harmful, and then it could drop down or it could continue going. And we don't we don't know what all of those frequency and intensity windows are. And that's because we're dealing with communication rather than a power effect.
There was testimony earlier to the effect that the pulse, I think I got this right.
Okay.
The pulse was 1.25 watts, or a range from 1 to 1.5 watts.
Okay, that's not the pulse, that's the power. So watts
Right.
measures power. And so that's how powerful your smart meter is in sending out information. A cell phone could be anywhere from 0.5 to 3 watts. A television station would be in kilowatts, thousands of watts. The higher the wattage, the higher the power, the further you can send that signal. That's what that means.
Okay, well, does the strength of the power have an effect on adverse health?
It can, yes. So if you're, okay, if for a cell phone to be harmful, you really have to hold it up to your head. If you hold it this far away, the amount of radiation that's getting to your head is really quite limited. When it comes to a cell phone antenna, we're finding that 300 to 400 meters is a critical distance. And when it comes to broadcast antennas or radar, we're talking about miles. So because they're more powerful, they have adverse effects at greater distances. But if you were, this close to something that had 1 watt power versus 10 watt power, you'd start increasing the heating effect because of the wattage, the power that your body's absorbing.
Well, at 1.25 watts, how much heating effect is there at a distance, say, of 7 inches?
Shouldn't be any. And that's what the guidelines are based on. So the guidelines we have from the Federal Communication Commission are based on a heating effect. And that's why we're below those guidelines. But it's not heat that's the critical metric here.
Are you aware of studies that have been done that show whether 7 pulses a day from a smart meter can produce adverse health effects in people?
Okay. There have been virtually no studies of smart meters that would pulse, 7 times a day. I don't know of any. I know of quite a few people and 2 studies where once a smart meter was introduced into the home, they got sick after a few days, a few weeks, a few months. And it started with that smart meter in the home. I actually don't think 7 pulses was the culprit. I think it was the dirty electricity that was on continuously. And one of the things, and this should not happen, so when I found out that people were getting sick once a smart meter was placed in their home, I started going out and measuring smart meters. And one of the things we found is that even though the utility said it pulses, once every 3 hours or whatever, we found that a lot of them were pulsing almost continuously. So that information has to be checked for every single meter, partly because of the buddy system, so we don't know if it's taking other communications. But I know of no studies that have looked at 7 pulses of just RF without the dirty power and whether or not that's harmful.
You said that there's dirty electricity all around us. And so when a smart meter is installed in a home, does that increase the amount of dirty electricity by a significant amount?
Yes.
Why?
Because it has the type of, the way it handles the power, it produces high voltages on the wire, and that's what's causing the problem. It's called a switch mode power supply, and I think they mentioned that there's a conductive power supply. They both, from my understanding, they both do the same thing. They both produce dirty electricity. But I'm not an engineer, so I'm basing this on my understanding of how smart meters work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Board Member Wagner?
Thomas, I want to ask you, you said you found that there were smart meters that were pulsing continuously. How do you know when a smart meter is pulsing or not pulsing?
You take a meter and you measure it. And you can see, I can show you, I can give you a demonstration of
Like
one
a voltage
on my
meter, an
computer.
RF meter?
You take an RF meter because it's RF energy. You can put a voltmeter on it as well if you want, but normally it's measured with a scope is the best way of measuring it, but you can take an RF meter as well.
How do you determine that it's the meter producing that and not some other device in the vicinity or on that line?
Most things don't pulse the way a smart meter pulses. They all have their pulsing characteristics. I have a PDF that's a sound that converts different technologies into a sound. So you can actually convert the frequency into a sound and we can hear it. And so if you look at what the smart meter sounds like versus Wi-Fi in your home or a cordless phone in your home, they have totally different frequency patterns, so you can tell them apart.
Okay. And I think you said that a smart meter produces electricity?
No, I didn't say that. If I did,
In your answer to Board Member Lazier, I thought that's what you said. Is that's
dirty electricity. It produces dirty electricity.
Well, it was in the answer. It was in the question Ms. Lazier asked. How does it produce dirty electricity? And you said when it
Through the switch mode power supply. That's what causes it.
for the power supply for the meter itself, not
Well, it's part
not
of the meter.
producing power.
It's part of the meter. That's how it functions through a switch mode power supply.
All right. Thanks.
I heard you state that there are filters available that can be placed on, for example, you used your computer as an example. How do you know whether or not a meter has this type of filter?
You would simply plug it in to an electrical outlet, turn it on, and then you have a meter that measures it. And when you turn it on, that meter will change. So you can tell if it's producing dirty electricity by how the meter reacts to it.
So how do you know a filter can be installed or used with a meter?
I have filters in my home. I have a electromagnetically clean home because I'm aware of the harmful effects, so I want to protect anyone who comes into my home, including myself. I have filters in my home that filter out dirty power. I produce some of it myself through, my computer, for example, and any electronic device. And when you plug that filter in, the levels go down right away. And so ideally you want them to go down beyond a certain point to minimize harmful effects.
Sorry.
Okay, so one of the things that could be done, and I don't know the technology with this particular meter that's being proposed for this community, but they can be filtered. Normally you can filter an electronic device. You can put in a tuned filter.
And if an entire community wanted to have this type of filter put in, regardless of what the cost is, in your expert opinion, would it address the issues that you've heard raised or aware of related to this case?
It would address the issues dealing with dirty electricity. It would not address the issues with the radio frequency that's sent out in bursts. So it would address one of the two health problems associated with these meters.
And to your knowledge, are you aware of any filtering system that has been created or used in any larger community?
I know of filtering systems that have been used in homes and in schools. I've done research with the filters, and we found we filtered 4 different schools, and we found that the wellness indicators that we used with teachers and the behavior indicators we used with students improved while the filters were in, compared to dummy filters that weren't filtering out any dirty power. So you can filter larger areas.
I heard you also state that you're not an engineer, but is it your opinion that a filter could be designed that could be included in a smart meter?
Definitely.
Is it also your expert opinion that if the pulsing occurred less frequently, that it would not be a health concern to you?
It would be much less of a health concern, yes. However, except in multi-residential setting where, even if it only pulses 5 times a day, but you've got, 100 people, it would then be a concern. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
What states were the schools evaluated?
One was in Canada, in Ontario, and the other one was in Minnesota. So we did 3 schools in Minnesota.
And are you able to share with us what schools were done in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's in the testimony. So our 3 school study is in the testimony. The one in Canada we didn't put in because it was just a repeat.
Does the testimony include what the filters cost the school districts?
No. I think the filters, first of all, there's different filters, and I just tested one variety that was available at the time. And those filters were about $50 a piece, but you need to filter every circuit in your home. So if you have 8 circuits, you have to filter all of them. And most homes might need 20 to 25 filters, depending on what they have in their home. So it's not unduly expensive. One of the things I know is that in Wisconsin, they filtered one of the schools. They had a school that had sick building syndrome, and the teachers and students were getting quite ill. And they thought it was very often when you have sick building, you think it's mold or chemicals. And they finally, in the summer, disinfected everything, removed rugs, cleaned up the chemicals they were using for cleaning. And the teachers and students came back, and they were still sick. They then brought in an electrical person who filtered the school, measured it, and found there was a lot of dirty power. He filtered the entire school, and health problems went away. Absolutely amazing. Children who had asthma, I think there were something like 37 of them that required inhalers every single day, stopped using their inhalers at school, but still needed them at home. And the principal of the school said that they saved quite a bit of money in replacing computers because they weren't malfunctioning as much. So it protects the electronic equipment and it protects human health. So it's something that all of our homes should be electromagnetically clean in this way, but it's not regulated.
Are you aware of the name of the school in Wisconsin?
I can get that for you.
Are you aware of the location in Wisconsin?
I can get that for you too. So I can get you the name of the principal as well if you like.
I'm just interested in the location.
Okay, I can't remember.
Your Honor, I have a follow-up based upon the questions that the board, or the answers that Dr. Havas has given.
So given the fact that I have granted great latitude in how we are handling this witness, you may proceed, Mr. Clisco.
Dr. Havas, can you point to a utility regulator anywhere in this country that's ever ordered filters to be put onto any devices that it regulates to filter dirty energy?
No, what I am familiar with is in Ontario, our utility is Hydro One, and they have an entire book on power quality issues, and they talk about filtering and the responsibility of the utility to keep the power clean. So that's regulated. And I can send you the link to that if you like. I think it's in one of the testimonies, is just the cover of that book.
And it's your testimony here today under oath that the provincial regulator in Canada has ordered Hydro One to put on filters to address dirty energy.
Hydro One has done it themselves because they're responsible for producing clean energy. And I don't know at what level that regulation comes in. I do know that utilities are required to do that. I suspect it's part of the IEEE 519 that is dealing with harmonics and electrical wiring.
I want to make sure I understand what you just said. You said the utilities are required the utility that you spoke about is required to put on this filter. That's what you just said.
No, I didn't. What I said was utilities are required to produce clean energy, to provide their customers with clean energy, and they have all sorts of technologies to improve power quality. They have their own filters that they can put on power lines. Very often industry will filter the power coming into their plants to make sure that they're protecting their sensitive electronic equipment. So filtering poor power quality is not an issue at all. It's been around forever, and IEEE regulates that. And the regulation is IEEE 519, and I think they just recently updated it in 2004 or 14 or something. So they have new regulations on that.
But you're not testifying today that the Canadian regulator requires dirty electricity filters. Is that correct?
Correct. They're responsible for producing clean energy and delivering clean energy to your home. That's all they're responsible for.
No further questions.
Mr. Marcus, any redirect?
Dr. Havas, there is an Exhibit JJ.
Can I get you to, closer to your mic?
Sorry. There is an Exhibit JJ to your rebuttal testimony that is titled Havas and Olsted 2008 Dirty Electricity in Schools. Would that be the study in schools in Minnesota?
That's correct.
Okay. Ms. Matera just handed me a note saying,
I saw that.
saying that her understanding is there's no filter on the market that reduces dirty electricity more than 50%.
I'm going to object. I believe Ms. Matera is now testifying through counsel to opposing party in cross-examination of her own witness.
I don't find that at all unreasonable given what we've been doing. So
I can't answer that question anyway, so.
Well, it actually,
Okay. Is there anything else for this witness?
no, Your
No.
Honor.
The witness may step down.
Thank you.
It is my intent.
I realize the answer might have helped you.
Mr. Schuling, would you like to call your first witness?
Your Honor, I have no objection to Mr. Schilling calling witnesses. We do have one more. Happy to call her whenever we need.
Well, my concern is I don't know how long it's going to take me to get through that one witness. I know that I'm pretty certain that Mr. Turner is not going to hold up on his retirement should I wait till the next day. So I want to
totally, completely understand. I just wanted to not lose track of one more witness.
I haven't. In fact, this seems like a good time. What I'm going to do is have you call your witness. We're going to start down that road. As soon as will you please go off the record for a moment? As soon as the board's pizza arrives, the board will eat, and then we will come back. So that's my intent there. Depending on what time, about 30 minutes is what I'm going to plan on. Then when we come back, we are going to finish with Mr. Turner. If we have enough time before 7:30, I'm going to have you call your remaining witness. That is my intent. Are there any questions? Okay. Mr. Cook.
OCA calls Brian Turner.
Mr. Turner, do you care which mic you use?
this is fine.
All right. Mr. Turner, we forgot something. Please raise your right arm. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate? You may be seated. Mr. Cook, you may proceed.
Please state your name for the record.
Brian W. Turner,
And by whom are you employed?
the Office of Consumer Advocate.
What is your position with the Office of Consumer Advocate?
I am Chief of the Technical Bureau,
And what is your business address?
The IUB OCA building, 1375 East Court, Des Moines, Iowa.
Did you prepare direct testimony and rebuttal testimony to Interstate Power and Light that was filed in this proceeding on September 24th, 2018?
Yes.
As part of that testimony, did you sponsor OCA Turner Direct and Rebuttal Exhibit 1?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or additions to your testimony?
No.
As you sit here today, are you declaring that the testimony you previously filed is true and correct?
Yes.
The testimony has, by stipulation of the parties, already been made part of the record. OCA makes Mr. Turner available for cross-examination.
Mr. Turner, sorry, Your Honor. Mr. Turner, in your view, the 4-day window that IPL has proposed is not reasonable, is that right?
Yes.
And were you here yesterday when Dave Vogensen was testifying?
Yes.
Did you learn, like I did, that it's an 8-day window?
Did realize that I had been assuming it was just 4 days at the end.
Is an 8-day window reasonable?
I would say it's more reasonable than a 4-day window. However, I think it probably still creates the same issues with people who are going to be gone for long periods of time.
Is a 12-day window reasonable?
Well, again, if a person is going to be gone for an extended period of time, it might not be.
So I take it from your testimony that no window is reasonable to you for a self-read?
Well, to the extent that it would cause the customer to fail in being able to retain its ability to stay on a non-standard meter, I think that would need to be examined. I don't necessarily believe an 8-day window would be unreasonable if the customer was allowed more than just 2 misses.
So how many misses are you comfortable with?
Pardon me?
How many misses are you comfortable with an 8-day window?
I believe in my testimony I said 4 consecutive reads is more reasonable, but again, I don't want to just set up reasons for the customer to be taken off of the non-standard meter option. So, I believe that what was provided earlier in the day by IPL in terms of estimating bills and then quarterly reads, there was, as I understood that, the customer was not going to lose its eligibility by missing reads because there would be no reads to miss.
So as you understand IPL Exhibit 218, only on the issue of self-reads, you believe, based upon your knowledge of it, that that's an appropriate approach?
I believe that it's a better approach in that it would not set up the customer to fail in case they were gone.
Would you object to that approach if the board ordered it?
I don't think that I would object to that approach in the terms of the meter reads.
You've done no studies on an Iowa customer's ability to read and submit their results within 4 days, have you?
No.
You've done no studies on this issue, have you?
No.
You've put no evidence into this case that supports your claim that the 4-day window is unreasonable other than your own opinion?
Yeah, it would be my opinion that that would cause too many cases of failure that might have legitimate reasons.
That opinion is based upon what?
That opinion is based upon what I believe, that after 2 misses, the customer would be taken off of the option to use a non-standard meter.
But I'm asking the facts upon which that opinion is based.
I just don't think that the option that's being, or the obligations that the company is providing there are reasonable.
You just don't like it?
I don't think it's reasonable.
Did you read, I'm going to change direction here, did you read Ms. Leyden Van Gundy's direct testimony on IPL's outreach to customers?
Yes.
And you have a concern about notice, is that right?
I have a concern about people who have lost their non-standard meter, who felt that they were not understanding what had happened and it was taken out without their knowledge.
So that's based upon the fact, in your view, if I'm characterizing it correctly, that IPL did not give enough notice about the opt-out issues relating to AMI?
I believe from reading some of the complaints that I have seen that that is the case, that
Sure.
they were not, that these customers were not well enough aware of what was going on.
You're aware that a bill insert went out to all customers in August and September of this year?
I understand that that is the case.
And you're aware that the IPL call center has staff who respond to these calls when they come in?
I'm sure they do.
And you're aware of the hold list process?
Yes.
And that hold list process includes that once somebody's on the list, they will no longer be on the service order for AMI?
Say that again, please.
That once somebody's on the hold list, they are taken off of the AMI install list?
That's my understanding, yes.
And that they will get a follow-up letter from IPL based upon what this board orders in this case?
That sounds reasonable.
And the customer then can opt out?
I believe so.
And that IPL was part of a meeting in Fairfield on November 16th, 2017 concerning this topic?
I'm not, what was the date on that?
November.
I'm not very well aware of that.
Okay, well, you're aware of the fact that this board held 6 meetings on the gas case that included, by design, the issue of AMI and opt-out?
In the gas rate case?
Correct.
I know that the board held meetings across the state on the gas rate increase. I don't know how much was gotten into regarding AMI.
Are you aware of an informational mail that goes out from IPL to customers if they have a question or concern about AMI technology?
Am I aware, say that again?
Are you aware of the fact that IPL has a mailer they put out to customers who have queries about AMI technology and its benefits?
I'm not specifically aware of that, but I would not doubt it.
Are you aware of IPL's obligation and actual responses to all the C-file complaints on these matters?
Am I aware of?
Of IPL's obligation to respond to C-file complaints
Yes.
on AMI? Assume for argument's sake that all those things happen as they did. What else would you have IPL do to give customers notice about AMI technology and the opt-out options it's providing?
Well, I believe that there's a concern that some customers well, as I'm looking at one complaint right here, it says I've opted out of a smart meter installation, but for the reason, without even knowing what alternatives are available or what they will cost me, Alliant wrote options. Once options are finalized with the IOB, you can select an alternative. I would assume that that alternative would mean that they would be able to receive their old meter back if they wished.
You've jumped to the request for an analog meter. My question to you is, assuming all the things I just said actually occurred in terms of IPL's notice to customers, what else would you have them do to notify customers of the AMI rollout and the NSMA option?
I think that what you've proposed is good. However, I think it needs to be, you need to make certain that everybody has received that information and understands what's going on. And I'm not convinced that that's the case.
What's your specific recommendation to get that done that's not been done already?
Speak to the person in person before you put that in and make sure that you have, that person is comfortable with that change.
Are you aware that IPL goes and knocks on the door before they put the AMI meter in?
Well, that's what I have been understood, that's the way it is, but from reading some of the complaints, it doesn't seem like that is the case.
So if IPL does what it says it is doing, are you comfortable with the notice that's been provided?
I'm comfortable with the notice that has been provided. I would like to be ensured that everybody has received and understands that notice.
No further questions.
Mr. Marcus? And if you would prefer, we can take a half-hour break.
I prefer it.
All right. We will come back in at 6 o'clock and resume with Mr. Turner. We are in recess. The Utilities Board is back in session. Mr. Marcus, you may proceed with testimony or cross-examination of Mr. Turner. Is your mic on?
Mr. Turner, when IPL goes to knock on the door, do you know whether or not, if there's no answer, they just install the smart meter or not? Do they wait to talk to the person?
I don't know.
Okay. Do you know of any companies who want consent to some option, let's say, that the company is offering, that have a telephone call and record the conversation?
Repeat that, please.
Well, credit card company or any other company, do you know of companies that when they're looking to verify that there was consent, that they record a telephone conversation?
Yes, I'm aware that that happens.
Do you think that would be a viable way of, in this situation, of assuring that you have a customer who understands and has given his consent?
Well, that certainly would work.
Okay. Do you know from the complaints to what extent when a customer calls and asks about some opt-out program, the IPO customer representatives are aggressive in getting them to not opt out?
I do not know.
Have you seen complaints in the docket about that?
About aggressiveness, I can't pick anything out at this moment.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Mr. Turner? Board Member Wagner? Board Member Lozier?
I have no questions.
Mr. Turner, I have a couple of questions as it relates to privacy of information that's obtained. I know that you have testimony in your direct testimony, page 7, you have had a chance to review the privacy policy that IPL has as it relates to smart meters or the selling or providing of the information free. Is that correct? Are you aware of the IPL privacy policy?
Yes, I have it attached as an exhibit.
Are you aware that one of the IPL witnesses testified that no customer information is sold?
I don't remember that exactly, that nothing is sold, but I just not quite sure I remember that being said.
Are you aware whether there's any customer information that's provided for free to any third-party entities?
Am I aware specifically that that has happened?
Yes.
I have no specifics that I could give you.
Do you believe that the privacy policy should be updated to ensure that customers are aware of what data is provided to third-party analytical companies?
I think that would be advisable, considering that more information is being collected from the smart meters than what has been collected before, and that customers might have an interest in protecting their privacy, or at least being clear about it.
Do you believe that it's the responsibility of the Iowa Utilities Board to ensure that that information is kept private?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that.
Okay. Do you believe that the Office of Consumer Advocate has a role in whether or not the privacy policy should include protections for consumer information?
I believe that if customers feel that there is a need for that, and that's an interest, that would be something that we would be interested in looking at too, as a customer issue.
Have you taken any position on whether or not the non-standard meter alternative should be something other than what is being offered by IPL?
Meaning like an analog meter,
Correct.
for example? And could you repeat the question again?
Do you believe that IPL should be offering something other than what they've defined as a non-standard meter alternative?
Yeah, our position is analog meters would, if a customer desires an analog meter and they're available, there's no reason not to give them one.
Are there any additional qualifications other than just being available that you would put on the analog meter?
I'm not sure that I would. I think that was part of Larry Shee's testimony. And I think his testimony was that if it's available and the customer was willing to pay for it if it had to, that is to change it out, there should be no reason not to. But again, that was his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Mr. Schuling, Mr. Cook, any redirect?
Just a few questions. Mr. Callisto went through the various notices and forms of communication that IPL used to contact customers about the installation of the AMI meter. Are you certain that those various communications and notices were used throughout the entire process?
No.
And do you know for certain that IPL had contact with every customer
No.
throughout the entire process?
No, I'm not, sir.
Okay. No further questions.
Mr. Turner, you may step down.
Now, may I ask just one follow-up question to that?
Yes, Mr. Clisto, you may.
Thank you. It may seg into two, but I promise it's the same idea, the
And
same
it
thing.
may end up back with Mr. Cook.
Fair enough. So I just want to focus on how IPL should communicate with its customers. Because I think you said on cross-examination from Mr. Marcus, and this, your words were, "This would work," end quotes. This would work for IPL to call every customer before it puts an AMI meter on their house. Is that accurate statement of what you said would work?
I believe what he said was call every customer and have it recorded.
Okay, so that's two
Or
things.
that customer had agreed.
So it's call them, record it, and get their agreement on that call. Do you, as you sit here, do you think that's a reasonable way for IPL to notify 500,000 electric customers and 240,000 gas customers, recognizing that there's some overlap there with dual accounts?
I'm not sure, but I think, as I said, that certainly would work if you called that customer and got a recording that verified that they were willing to do that. That would work.
And a bill insert does not do the same thing?
A bill insert would presume that the person read the bill insert and knows about it.
Shouldn't customers be held to what they get in the mail from their utility?
Customers do what customers do.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Cook, any further redirect?
No further.
Mr. Turner, you may step down and you are excused. Mr. Schuling, you may call your next witness.
OCA calls as its next witness Blake Kruger.
It's on now.
Thanks.
Mr. Kruger, do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate?
Yes, I do.
You may be seated.
Thanks.
Mr. Schuling?
Thank you. Would you please state your name?
My name is Blake Kruger, K-R-U-G-E-R.
And by whom are you employed?
I'm employed by the Office of Consumer Advocate.
And what is your position with that office?
I'm a utility analyst.
Did you prepare direct testimony, rebuttal testimony to Interstate Power and Light that was filed in this proceeding on September 24th, 2018?
Yes, I did.
And did you prepare, as part of that testimony, OCA Kruger direct exhibits?
Yes, I did.
And was that direct exhibit 1?
That's correct.
Do you have any corrections or additions to your testimony?
I have one correction. On
Yeah.
page 4 of my direct testimony, line 1, Exhibit X should be Exhibit 1.
Okay, and wait just a minute. So
I'm sorry.
we've just pulled it up on the screen, and are you talking about
Yeah, right
line
there.
1, Exhibit X?
Correct.
And that should be
Exhibit 1.
any other corrections or additions?
None.
As you sit here today, are you declaring that the testimony and exhibits that you filed are true and correct?
I am.
The testimony's already been pre-admitted for this particular witness, and we would make Mr. Kruger available for cross-examination.
Mr. Kruger, you were here yesterday for the testimony of Randy Bauer,
I was.
and you heard from Mr. Bauer there's approximately 500 AMI meters that are fully operational right now.
Fully operational in that,
They're using the AMI technology to essentially push out a bill.
they're not using meter readers.
Correct.
For those 500.
Correct.
I believe, subject to check, that is what Mr. Bauer's testimony was.
So with the exception of those 500 meters, all other IPL accounts, both electric and gas, are having their meters read by meter readers, as has been done traditionally, right?
At this moment, that's correct.
And there's obviously a cost to that, correct?
A cost to,
To having meter readers in the field.
at this moment, yeah.
And to have the AMI system fully functional until September of 2019.
I believe that's what Mr. Bauer said yesterday.
And so until that time, IPL is going to have meter reading expenses, correct?
I believe Mr. Bauer testified that there will be a provisioning process where they'll be switching these meters out over time. And so over the course of from now until September of 2019, there will be a fall off throughout that time.
But you don't deny that there are meter reading costs that IPL is going to incur up until the time it stops using its current technology and fully implements AMI reading.
Right, there will still be some meter reading expenses as they read meters manually.
And there'll be some meter reading expenses actually after as well.
That's right, I believe there's a smaller amount.
No further questions.
Mr. Marcus, you can simply nod your head if you have questions or, okay. The nod was yes.
Mr. Kruger, I think the question that Mr. Callisto is asking related to whether IPL was entitled to compensation for the meter readers who are still reading meters despite the fact that there are AMI meters on the residences or commercial buildings. Is that correct?
Can you restate that? I'm not sure I'm following.
I think IPL is asking you whether or not they're deserving of some compensation for continuing to have meter readers despite the fact that there are AMI meters that are operational but not reading bills. Is that your understanding?
I don't know if that was the intent of their question,
Okay.
but I think what I'm hearing you say is that IPL is recovering meter reading expenses currently, which are based on the historical test year of 2016 for the electric case and in 2017 for the gas case. So collectively, they're recovering about $11 million in meter reading expenses, which will slowly trickle off over time.
Okay.
And eventually, by September of 2019, there will be a significantly smaller amount than the $11 million figure that was built into rates.
Is there any issue in your mind that before IPL is provided with funds for the meter reading, that there should be a determination of whether they adequately gave notice to the customers before putting up the AMI meter?
That was not part of my testimony.
Okay. I thought Mr. Callisto just said that only 500 meters are live, or did I miss something, or was it 500,000 meters are live?
He said 500. There's currently 500. I think he was characterizing Mr. Bauer's testimony from yesterday, in which I believe 500 meters went through the provisioning process and went live, meaning that their meter readers are not reading 500 IPL meters
Right.
as of October of 2018.
I have no further questions.
Board Member Wagner. I already asked him and he said no.
Mr. Kruger, IPL witness Vogensen says that IPL cannot wait to implement a charge until a future rate case, as you've proposed. I'm assuming you would still disagree with that statement,
Right.
and the reason is?
Well, IPL's based on their what Mr. Vogensen said that IPL will be coming in for an electric rate case in early 2019. And IPL's rates are currently built upon, as I mentioned, about $8 million in electric meter reading expenses and $3 million or $3.2 million in natural gas meter read expenses. As currently structured, customers will be paying rates that include that $11 million figure, if you will. And if they charge the $15 on top of that, customers will be paying meter reading expenses in their current rates, because the current rates are based on the $11 million of meter reading expenses recorded in FERC account 902. And then they will also be paying another $15 essentially for meter reading expenses again.
In the gas rate case, how was the meter reading expenses determined? Because that rate case has been settled and...
Right. The gas rate case you're talking in RPU 2018-0002.
Yes.
In that case, it was a settled case, but in the test year 2017, they included $3.2 million of meter reading expenses in those rates.
And the OCA agreed with that settled amount?
Yes, the settled amount included the test year $3.2 million for account 902.
Even though the same situation would occur there, that those meter readers will be gradually
Right. This was a
dropping
historical
off.
test year, and the AMI investment was not included in the final rates, and so then there was no corresponding adjustment for meter reading expense reduction.
So how is that different than the situation that we're in today with the electric side?
I'm not sure I'm following you.
The expenses for the electric side meter reading are based on the last rate case, which I don't recall off the top of my head. I think it was 2017. So those meter reading expenses are not changed.
Right.
In the gas case, they have not changed.
No.
They will not change in the gas case.
No.
And they will not change in electric case.
In the upcoming electric case?
No, currently.
The rates that are currently set in 2017 for electric include the meter reading expenses.
Correct.
They will not change.
And they also are included in the gas rate case that was just recently.
Right.
But you said in the
The
gas
gas
case,
portion, yeah,
the
in the
gas
gas
case,
case.
there are no expenses for the AMI side,
Right.
correct?
Right.
Are there expenses in the current rates being paid in electric side?
No.
For?
No, that will.
So how are these two different? How is the situation in the electric side and the gas side different with relation to both AMI expenses and meter reader expenses, both in rates and?
As we sit today, there is no difference.
Okay. So, in the gas case, I'm assuming you still oppose a fee for a meter there?
Right, because the rates that customers are paying were built upon $3.2 million in meter reading expenses that are no longer, that are going to be much lower.
Are there other expenses that IPL has that they may not be recovering on currently?
I'm sure there are some.
Are there expenses that they're over-recovering on?
There's a possibility of that as well.
So then how do you determine that a fixed charge is not the appropriate direction to go?
You mean a fixed charge going forward?
No, well, and I guess I shouldn't say fixed charge. I don't want to confuse it with a bill, but a charge for a non-standard meter. Why is that not appropriate if there are expenses that are directly related to the cost of having a non-standard meter?
Oh, hold on a second. What you previously asked me when you said, are there expenses? Did you mean just any expense?
Just general expenses,
Right.
yes.
And now you're saying, I'm trying to track with you.
Yeah.
What are you saying here? What's the question?
So there are general expenses that IPL might be recovering. There are general expenses they may not be recovering based on changes from the test year.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is the contention of the OCA is that because the meter reading is already in rates, that we can't take into account any changes because that should come up in the next rate case. But at the same time, you're arguing that.
Right. I think it's the appropriate time for this to be dealt with instead of this non-standard meter alternative charge at this point is the upcoming rate case. And at that point, then it's appropriate to come up with a more realistic non-standard meter alternative because the meter reading expenses will be reflective of the current situation.
So how does the board do that in the gas rate case?
I think it would be, well, the current gas rate case is the RPU 18.
Yes.
I think that is, the current rates are built on $3 million of meter reading expenses, and until there's another gas rate case, I believe that there should be no non-standard meter alternative charge because customers are already paying meter reading expenses.
So why did the OCA not include that in a settlement?
Because it was based on a historical test year, and the AMI investment was not in service by 9 months past the historical test year.
So the OCA is okay with the gas rates being set on a $3 million expense for meter readers until the next rate case, even though it knew IPL would not have meter readers at the end of September 2019.
Right, the investment was not included either. And so if we didn't include the investment, then it wouldn't be appropriate to include the meter reading expense reduction. That would be a violation of the matching principle.
And there's no expenses in the current electric rates for AMI, correct?
Right, right.
So it's the exact same situation.
Yeah,
So again,
that's-
I get back to
that's what
why
I
should
said.
there not be a charge if IPL can demonstrate that there is an added cost to providing a non-standard meter? Why should they not be able to address that cost just like they do with
Right,
construction in aid of
right.
Cost in aid in construction, 2 meters. There are several situations in tariffs where a customer, by their own choosing, elects to pay more for a certain service that IPL offers.
Right, and I think this is specifically designated to meter reading expenses. Customers are paying $8 million in electric meter reading expenses that are already included in rates, and they shouldn't have to pay for meter reading expenses through their current rates of the $8 million, and then again through the non-standard meter alternative. IPL, those meter reading expenses will fall off over time, as Mr. Clisto said, through, I believe, September of 2019. At that time, they'll have a much smaller amount of meter reading expenses, probably less than $1 million or so. And at that point, the meter reading expenses in the new rate case will reflect that smaller amount, and the non-standard meter alternative charge will be appropriately set at that time.
So you don't think IPL should be allowed to recover any additional costs? Well, let's go to Vogelson's testimony. His direct testimony has the chart of what all the costs are based on. $3.51 for manual inputs in the billing system, $12.59 for manual read verification, 21 cents for system maintenance, 90 cents for carrying cost, and then a $1.33 credit. Do you think any of those other items IPL should be able to collect? Not related to meter reading?
Do you want to wait until she gets it pulled up so you can see it?
Sure.
Can you restate?
Yeah, yes, it's in Vogelson's direct on page 15, starting at line 19.
Again, I think the rate case proceeding, the upcoming rate proceeding, is the appropriate venue to address this non-standard meter alternative charge. So I don't know if I can speak to the specific charges in Mr. Vogelson's testimony at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Lozier?
Thank you. Mr. Kruger, is it your position that if the $15 per meter per month charge is allowed, that IPL would in effect be double recovering the cost of reading meters?
Yeah, I believe so. They're already recovering. Like I said, the rates are currently built on $8 million in electric meter reading expenses and $3 million in natural gas meter reading expenses. Those expenses are no longer going to incur in the future to that extent. There will be plenty of savings in which they will have to cover the amount for the 2,800 customers up until the point in which the AMI investment will come into rate base in the upcoming rate case. And the appropriate level of meter reading expenses will be reflected in the new rates.
Thank you.
Mr. Kruger, you made the statement, or I thought I heard you make the statement, that the investment for the gas side, on the gas side for the meters, was not included in the test year. Is that a correct restatement?
The AMI was, nothing related to AMI was included in the gas case.
Is it your understanding that there are currently some customers who are paying for meter reading but are not having their meters read because they've already gone on to the AMI meter?
It's my understanding, based on what Mr. Clisto referenced to Mr. Bauer's testimony yesterday, there are 500 customers at that point right now.
And as each month passes, another, let's just say, for example, 100 to 500 will be moving off of the meter reading, correct?
I think it'll be a much greater magnitude than that, because we're going from 500 to 500,000 over the course of the next 12 months or so, 11, 12 months. But yes, that would be.
And for my information, if IPL comes in for a forward-looking test year, how would these costs be interpreted?
How would the meter reading expenses be interpreted? Well, my understanding is that the meter reading expenses would be reflective of the, I believe it would be a forecasted test year, and IPL would be projecting that. So obviously the $8 million figure would be drastically lower than that, because the meter readers, the labor, the overtime, the vehicle expenses of all those would be would go quite a bit down. And the forecasted test year would include a more representative level of meter reading expenses going forward.
And if, for instance, IPL makes the determination that they don't need to come in for an electric rate case for, let's say, 3 to 5, 10 years, how do you feel that things should be handled at that point?
Customers are still paying meter reading expenses based on they're paying meter reading expenses that cover meter reading costs, and these customers shouldn't have to pay the non-standard meter alternative because the meter reading expenses are already built in there, and they shouldn't have to pay meter reading expenses twice, as I mentioned to Mr. Lozier.
In your opinion, should the Iowa Utilities Board even take into consideration that IPL has suggested that it's coming in for a rate case?
I don't know that I can answer that.
All right. Mr. Schuling, would you like any redirect?
I have no redirect.
Mr. Kruger, you may step down and you are excused. Mr. Schuling, you may call your next witness.
OCA calls Mr. Seth Davison.
Hello, Mr. Davison. Please raise your right arm. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate?
I do.
You may be seated.
Please state your name.
Seth Davison,
By whom are you employed?
Office of Consumer Advocate.
What is your position with the Office of Consumer Advocate?
I am a utilities analyst.
What is your business address?
1375 East Court Avenue, Des Moines, Iowa.
Did you
hear me all right?
Yes. Did you prepare direct testimony and rebuttal testimony to Interstate Power and Light that was filed in this proceeding on September 24th, 2018?
I did.
As part of that testimony, did you sponsor OCA Davison Direct and Rebuttal Exhibits 1, 2, 3, and 4?
I did.
Do you have any corrections or additions to your testimony?
Yes, I do. If you flip to page 11 of my direct testimony. Okay, looking at lines 5, and it continues on to line 6. The sentence reads, the $2.46 is then annualized to be 21 cents. That should read rather, the $2.46 over 12 months is 21 cents per month.
Do you have any other corrections or additions?
I do not.
As you sit here today, are you declaring that the testimony you previously filed is true and correct?
I am.
The testimony has, by stipulation of the parties, already been made part of the record. OCA makes Mr. Davison available for cross-examination.
Mr. Grageldinger?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening. In your testimony on page 3 going on to page 4, you referred to IPL standard meter, the AMI meter, as being a newly proposed standard metering equipment. Are you aware whether the board has to approve the metering technology that a utility uses?
I am not.
are you aware of whether the board has ever approved a metering technology which a utility chooses?
I am not.
Over the course of time, is it fair to say that utility technology can evolve like other technology?
Yeah, that's fair.
And new and improved technology can come along?
That is also fair to say.
And as new and improved technology comes along, a utility to help improve reliability, ensure customer satisfaction, may adopt new technology, correct?
That is correct.
And over the course of installing this new technology, that could require the change out of equipment either on a one-time basis or over the course of time, is that correct?
I don't see why not.
And over the course of a utility's life, this could happen on utility lines, by way of example. It could happen on meters. Is that fair?
Yes, it is.
Would it be wise, scratch that. As a utility is replacing equipment, at various points in time, the new equipment could reflect a small percentage of what's installed, and the old equipment a larger percentage. Is that fair?
It is. Unfortunately, it hasn't been the case for IPL. You wanted me to elaborate on that?
No, thank you. The question is, I guess, how quickly do you believe a utility must flip out all of its meters for if they want to call it their standard meter?
Per the testimony provided by Mr. Bauer yesterday, IPL stopped installing analog meters in the year 2010 because digital meters were their new meter, their standard metering technology. Also, per Mr. Bauer's testimony yesterday, something like, don't quote me on this, but 80 or 70% of meters in the field prior to the rollout were still analog. So
if the older technology, assuming that the digital meter was the then standard technology, you just testified that it wouldn't surprise you that a smaller percentage could be installed, correct?
Smaller percentage?
The amount of meters installed, that's the standard, could be smaller than the historic meters.
Yes, but I would hope. Yeah.
On page 4 of your testimony at lines 15 going on to 16, you refer to IPL proposing a $15.85 charge. Is that your understanding? Or a $15.87 charge, sorry. Is that your understanding of the charge that IPL is proposing?
That was my understanding of the charge calculated provided with an attachment A, or I believe, and filed in part with Bogenson's testimony, Mr. Bogenson's testimony. $15 is the charge I believe the company proposed. I was talking about the derivation of the charge that was then rounded down to 15, rounded down, used loosely there. So I was just talking about the calculation of that figure that was then used to derive the $15.
Okay, so it's fair to say instead of IPL is proposing a $15.87 charge, IPL is proposing a $15 charge. Would that be correct? On page 7 of your testimony, lines 3 to 5, you contend that IPL's estimates are inflated. Have you conducted an independent analysis of IPL's cost structure for its non-standard metering alternative?
Insofar as what IPL provided, I have.
And by that, do you mean you've reviewed what IPL provided?
Yes, sir. And in my review of what IPL provided, you will find in Davison Direct Exhibit 1, OCA data request number 9, IPL seemed to lack the due diligence that you are requesting me to have conducted, as far as looking at the exact geographical distribution of these customers and then coming up with a more than just an estimate. And that's where I concluded, that's on the grounds on which I concluded that these are possibly inflated.
When IPL first proposed this tariff, it was February of 2018, correct?
Give me one moment. We're referring to the tariff filing 18, 29, and 30, is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, revisions filed March 1st, 2018 to that filing, so.
And before IPL offered a non-standard metering alternative, would it have necessarily had information on what customers would opt out?
No.
And would it be reasonable for IPL to make reasoned assumptions as to, given its service territory, where customers may opt out?
Yes.
On page 9 and 10 of your testimony, you talk and then provide as exhibits information on a public service company of Oklahoma testimony and tariff. Do you recall that?
I do.
Did you do a specific comparison of PSC of Oklahoma's territory compared to IPL's territory beyond the general square mileage that you referenced in number of customers?
Yes, I mean, we have a utility that serves a very geographically dispersed territory that has a segment of the population, or a segment of the state in the eastern part of the state and in the western part of the state, quite far apart, similar to your own company. But beyond that, no, I was simply, no.
So you didn't necessarily look to see the size of municipalities within their service territory, customer concentrated areas?
No.
Is it your belief that one utility's service territory is necessarily representative of another utility's service territory?
Absolutely not.
On page 10 of your testimony, lines 12 through 21, you talk about the application of the $15 charge for both natural gas and electric customers. Can I call them combination customers?
Yeah, sure.
So you contend that there shouldn't be a second charge for combination customers. They should only incur one, correct?
No, that's a mischaracterization.
How would you characterize it?
There is a quote, I'm going to quote from lines 15 through 21. You want me to read it to you?
That's fine.
Okay. It is unreasonable and unjust to charge a combination service customer the full verification read cost recovery component twice, and that's what I was talking about specifically. There is nothing on record indicating why both verification reads cannot take place during the same visit. As such, it is inappropriate to recover this cost twice from these customers, especially when this element of the charge represents 80% of the cost and amounts to $302 annually.
So it's not the full cost, but
80% of the cost.
80%.
I was speaking specifically about that charge for the CFR, the customer field representative to make a visit to read the meter of somebody who is receiving both forms of service from the company.
So you would be okay with the additional 20% being charged, roughly $3, for an $18 charge for combination customers?
In the abstract, yes. In this context, no.
Are you aware that IPL charges a different customer charge for electric customers and a different customer charge for gas customers?
Fully aware.
Are you aware that IPL's meter readers read both the gas and electric meters at the same time when they go to read meters?
I mean, that makes sense to me. I was not aware.
Is it fair to say it's a long accepted practice that electric and gas customers each receive a customer charge, even if they're a combination customer?
Yes, I think that's a fair characterization of that.
If the number of meter reads done for the non-standard metering alternative increases, could the cost of the non-standard metering alternative ultimately change?
I would hope so, as I hope it's related to cost causation, if one is to go into effect.
Do you agree that a utility should seek to make its services more efficient?
Yes.
And do you agree that a utility can and should pursue such upgrades to promote efficiency regardless of the timing of a specific rate case?
Yeah.
If customers desire options and the utility seeks to respond to that, do you think the utility should be bound to only provide those options during a rate case?
No.
Thank you. I have no other questions.
Mr. Marcus? Is your mic on?
If the utility is charging $12.59 for the customer service representative to read meters, and the person just has an electric meter, not a gas meter,